All right, hello and welcome to the Wednesday, January 9th edition of the Cluster API sub-project meeting for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. As you might notice, today's meeting recording looks a little bit different. Zoom appears to be having an outage, and so we're using Google video chat instead. Hopefully this records and uploads normally to YouTube, and if you're watching this, then I guess it worked. All right, so we'll go ahead and dive into the agenda. Tim, you've got the first thing, which is a vote on moving the Azure provider from Platform 9 over into Kubernetes SIGs. You want to say something about that?
I'm looking at the old meeting notes. Can someone share a link real quick? Because for whatever reason, I think I have the old calendar.
Sure. This may have just been moved over from last week. It may not be actually relevant anymore. The link in Slack. Here
yes, that was the, we just need to do the formalizing of it, which is basically yay or nay on this call.
Okay. Was this previously discussed?
It was not previously discussed. There was a PR that was made to create the repo, but part of the process to create the repos is to have a up vote down vote.
Yeah, I thought I saw something go by maybe on the mailing list about this, maybe a week or so ago.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Oh, December 22nd was when Stephen Augustus sent out an email. And he said lazy consensus by Friday, January 4th, which we are past. And he sent out an email yesterday, January 8th, saying that they've officially moved into Kubernetes SIGs. So I think this has already happened.
Well, timing for voting or whatever, it doesn't matter. I don't think there's going to be any contentiousness, but like voting over the holiday-ish time frame is generally bad form. But I don't think there's any contention there.
Yeah, there was certainly none on the email thread that I saw. I think the only reason we hadn't adopted it sooner was sufficient sort of committers from enough diverse companies, and I think that they solved that problem. So that was really the big holdup the first time that they asked to be adopted. Okay. Move on next, Jason, KubeBuilder updates. I saw Justin just merged the PR, I think, last week to update us up to 112. Looks like you're working on 113.
Yeah, so right now KubeBuilder depends on Kubernetes 112 to be able to unlock the conversion webhooks in KubeBuilder. We need to get that revved up to Kubernetes 113. So I've got an active PR out there for controller runtime right now, and I have local change sets for controller tools in KubeBuilder, but because of the way the dependency chain works, I kind of have to stage them one at a time. So once I get the controller runtime one merged in, I'll get a PR put up there for controller tools and then eventually KubeBuilder. And then once that's finally done, we can start looking at what does it take to enable the conversion webhooks within KubeBuilder, and then hopefully we'll be able to consume those. I don't know if it's just me or not.
Robert is he's muted.
Yes. I try to hit the mute button when I'm not talking. I sometimes forget to unmute. I was saying that it looks like you assigned the PR to Solly, and he had a question for you. And I think upgrading to 1.13 to get this functionality sounds great, assuming we don't break things along the way. So I think that's the main concern.
Yeah, I've been able to run everything up through the KubeBuilder tests. I ran into a fun little issue trying to get those to pass because of the Klog migration, and it turned out it was kind of dependency, vendor dependency fun within KubeBuilder itself. But as far as I can tell, there's no breaking changes that are part of it so far.
I'm just wondering on that. I guess it's a different topic, but or a different forum. But like, if there had been breaking changes, would that mean that class controller runtime would need per Kubernetes versions? I guess, and yeah. But I guess that's a topic for that group rather than our group.
Yeah, there was. They have a document on versioning, and there's They want to maintain semantic versioning much better than kind of the core Kubernetes objects that they consume. But it's unclear to me because they're still technically major version 0, whether or not that would even really apply at this point or not. So the only change that came in was an additive change to the REST client. So I don't think that would have an effect either way, but it'll be interesting to see what happens going forward with that.
Cool. Well, definitely thank you for the work getting that updated. I'm looking forward to be able to use all the fun new features we get with CRDs. I saw an email thread the other day that things like Swagger definitions for CRDs are coming in some future release also. So I think keeping up with new releases is great because CRDs are definitely gaining features quite quickly. Cool. All right, next, Vince has a question about the current status and future of the relationship between cluster/machines and namespaces. Did you want to elaborate on your question, or was that the whole question?
That was the whole question. I also saw a PR that like somebody wanted to remove the restriction. I'm gonna put it in the meeting.
So she's just pointed to a PR that he put in last August that allows API objects to be in multiple namespaces. Is that the one you're thinking? Anything about an issue? Let's see.
So like right now, like we kind of like assume that like a cluster of machines in a single namespace are all related to each other. Was wondering like, do we want to go in this direction? Do we want to have like a tight relationship, like one-on-one between namespaces and cluster and machines? Or do we want to allow multiple cluster machines to live in a single namespace?
So when I was started to, and I authored that PR, the consensus was we wanted one cluster per namespace, and that's the premise under which the entire PR was kind of structured. So that's the at least that's from as far as I can remember.
Yeah, that is the current assumption. I'm curious to know like if the current the group here like wants to make this kind of official, or because like right now it's more like of an assumption than actually like a rule. And so because like we have upcoming work in cluster API AWS around this, it would be great to make it somewhat official.
I think that I think I saw Hardik on the line. I think Hardik has also mentioned in the past that in their experience developing Gardener, that they found it really useful to have multiple clusters in the same namespace. And in particular, because when you're referencing secrets, Kubernetes resources can only reference secrets within the same namespace. And so if you had, say, multiple clusters that were using the same project or account or whatever at a cloud provider, you don't have to duplicate the credentials to access that account into multiple secrets in multiple namespaces. You can put everything into a single namespace referencing the same secret. And so they've definitely found that useful in Gardener.
Yeah, also personally found that useful when, for example, the namespace defines the org structure in a company. So that you want to compartmentalize like clusters, for example, like a team A, B, and C. So, but if we want to move in that direction, we have to add more changes, I guess, upstream.
So I was able to pull out the comment that from the issue where we discussed this. I think Jessica chimed in saying that as a community we decided to have one cluster per namespace. I linked that comment to the meeting docs.
Well, at the time.
Yeah, at the time, yes.
Ideas change, like with experience. So, especially given how nascent cluster API is.
I know that we don't have, as far as I know, in the Kubernetes API, other than here, we don't have this like singleton concept, and I don't know whether we should talk to, I know there are people that do API reviews. I don't know whether we can get their input in general on this issue, and then just cast an eye over our whole API and maybe help us on some of the spec versus status questions, which I know we've sort of rattled on in the past.
I think you're better off doing it informally than formally, just because of the sheer amount of volume that they have and the amount of time it takes to get it done. I think it'd be a good idea. I'm just saying, be careful what you wish for or ask for.
That's fair. It'd be nice to know that we had done it, I guess. I will see if I can track any one of them down. I don't think any of them are in the same building I am in today.
So I just wanted to add that one of the challenges that we're going to face if we sit there and try to eliminate the cluster per namespace, and that being the link and the namespace being the link between machines and clusters, is that there are users that only want to make use of the machines API independent of the cluster object. So if we do create a link between the two, we need to ensure that that link stays optional and doesn't become a mandatory link at that point.
Right. So I think there are a couple of ways we could do that. One, we could put an explicit link between the two, but another is we could do something like label selectors, right, to match which things go together, right? I think that's a pretty standard way the things are collected in groups in Kubernetes. It would be a little bit more flexible, and it would probably also be quite prone to error, right? Because you could pretty easily create machines in a namespace that didn't match a label selector for a cluster, and then are they orphaned, where do they belong, et cetera. But I think that would give you the flexibility to say, here are two different clusters in this namespace, and here are machines, and here's how we select which ones belong to which cluster. Right.
And the other thing that came up during that discussion was cluster management using RBACs. So you can say this group, this user group can operate in this namespace, in this particular namespace, and as a result, they can be admins for this cluster only. So that was another thing that came up, that was discussed. I'm just recollecting everything that I can at the moment.
Justin, you mentioned that there aren't really other examples in Kubernetes of singletons, and you're saying basically like the enforcement of you can only have one cluster in a namespace. If you try to create more, we will reject it. There aren't really other places in like the Kubernetes resource model where we see that pattern used, right?
I was going to make that statement, and I sort of backed away from it because I'm like, I don't know of them. But yeah, I don't know if anyone has a counterexample.
I do not know of any.
Yeah, I mean, I think even if there is a counterexample, it's certainly not common, right? I mean, I guess maybe that's a better way to put it, is it doesn't seem to be the common pattern to do that.
And I think that I think Hardik, did you bring up the case that people want to use machines without the cluster API? I think that's true, but I think like even in, for example, the COPS case, we wouldn't object to creating a cluster object. We just wouldn't use it to describe all like the complete configuration of the cluster. So I think Robbie, you suggested a label selector in a cluster which selected a group of machine deployments, no problem. Like I don't think that's a big deal for anyone. So I think that I don't think that would be a blocker. I think that the people that don't necessarily want to start with just adopting the machines API just don't want to fully describe their cluster in the cluster object, or aren't ready to fully describe their cluster in the cluster object.
I think that's true. I think the other use case, there are sort of two use cases there that Jason was alluding to. One is to just adopt the machines part of the API, but the other is some people have talked about putting the machines and the cluster resources in two different places, and having a link between resources that are not within the same sort of Kubernetes resource universe doesn't really work, right? So if you wanted to have your cluster object in one Kubernetes cluster and your machine object in a different Kubernetes cluster, like how would you create the link between those two at that point?
Can you
Yeah, it
elaborate?
will also be difficult to like drive that change across various providers that are already under implementation. So that will mean everybody will have to march together forward on to that change once we make it.
But it could be opt-in, right? Like if we do the label, like providers can still like use the old implementation for now, and then in their own time just like assign the labels like on the machines and tie them to a cluster if exists.
Right. I think, I mean, right now we just assume same namespace, same cluster. And so I think as a provider wanted to make that a little more nuanced and say you can put multiple clusters in a namespace, they would also have to have a way of linking them. And if we decide the way of linking them is labels, the provider would implement that sort of at the same time, right? And verify that sort of backwards, if you just did have one in a namespace, we still made all the labels match up, and we'd have to figure out what happens if things don't match into the label selectors, like what do machine controllers do, right?
Like we're tangenting, but I feel like instead of a label selector, because the problem with the label selector, like a label selector is great for many to many, but this is a strict one to many. In other words, if I have a machine deployment that matches into two clusters, we're in trouble. And so like another of my approach might be to have a field in the machine deployment which pointed to a cluster, like have the name of a cluster, possibly like it could even be qualified into another, I don't know, another cluster, another API's cluster. But if it wasn't there, then we could fall back to the same namespace rule. So you'd only need to put it in there if you have multiple clusters running in the same namespace. I don't know, but yes.
Why don't I open an issue around this, and so we can all chime in and discuss? Seems it's I'm kind of getting lost at this point.
Yeah, I think the important thing first is to sort of, if we want to rehash the decision of more than one per namespace, we should agree on that first before we delve into the different ways that we could do it. Because, you know, with the issue that was linked to earlier, it was sort of closed saying like, we agreed to just do one per namespace. And so first question is, do we want to re-adjudicate and say, there are valid use cases with more than one namespace that sort of better aligns with the Kubernetes resource model, et cetera. And then if so, how would we actually make that work? So Vince, why don't you at least start the issue with that first question, and we can say like link back to the old issue and say, I think here's some reasons why we might want to reverse that decision at this point.
Sounds good.
Cool. Thank you. All right, not to take the spotlight off you, you've got the next one also, which is requirements to become an approver. I think we briefly touched on this before the end of the year. Maybe just you and I were chatting in Slack. So I think, Vince, you'd sent a PR to add yourself as an approver to Cluster API. We don't have a ton of approvers right now, and a lot of them are quite inactive, and I feel like I should be removing them. And so I guess the question for the group is, when somebody like Vince says, I've been doing a lot of code reviews, I feel like I understand the project, I'd like to be considered an approver so that we can speed up the rate at which PRs can be merged. What sort of criteria do people sort of want to see in those people that are getting promoted, so that we all agree, hopefully mostly objectively, that it's the right decision to promote, and we don't become sort of biased and promote either people like ourselves, people from the same company, et cetera. And we have sort of the most unbiased and objective system in place that we can get to sort of create new approvers. Because we certainly don't want to get in the case where it's impossible to become a new approver. It's so hard. There's so many barriers to reach that we don't get anymore, because eventually we'll have none. But we also don't want to make it too easy, right? Because we want to have sort of the feeling among the people in the community that the approvers sort of have the best interest of everybody and are sort of making the right decisions. Right?
I can tell you what we do for KubeADM, and it's worked out pretty well. We basically submit a PR with a very long timeout and CC all the people who are going to be out of rotation, as well as add the people who we want to add in the rotation, give time for folks to give a timeout of like a couple of weeks for folks to chime in if they want to. But we do often rotate people out because what'll happen is, if you don't do this, is they'll get assigned issues, and the PRs will then just lag in perpetuity forever, just because that's how the way the bot works. And there's no reason, we often tell them, like, we'd happy to have you back if you have time to work on these things. But the rotation policy that we followed has worked fairly well, and we've done a fair amount of rotations now across several release cycles. But another thing too is it prevents the nepotism, because the people who are active will be active, right? And be working on things.
I think that's sort of mechanically how you rotate, and I love the getting rid of people part. How, when you select the people to be added, like, what are the sort of criteria for those people being picked? Is it just
typically it's typically self-evident, right? Like, it's a self-selection because they're actively involved and engaged in the project. Approvers are typically a higher bar. Adding people to a reviewer list is totally legitimate if they're reasonably active. But if they have a stake and they're full-time devoted towards this and are clearly engaged, it becomes self-evident if they should be an approver or not. Right? Like, when we added Lubomir, there was no question. Everyone who's already an approver said, yes, please get Lubomir to be an approver.
Okay, so maybe we should just do that with Vince's PR, and instead of having it's not linked here, but I remember seeing it at some point. Instead of having it just add him, maybe we can update that to also kick some people out, CC all those people specifically, link it here, and let people know that if they feel like they should also be added as a reviewer or approver, they should sort of piggyback on that same change, and we'll set a timeout for a couple weeks. How does that sound?
I think that sounds good, Robbie. I really like your idea of making it more mechanical to add people so that we avoid bias. I think we can do that with reviewers by looking at the volume of reviews. I don't know how we would do that with approvers, but I think we can, maybe if we start with like a script that looks at like who has done the most reviews or the most comments or whatever it is. Like, anyone can write an LGTM comment, even if it doesn't mean anything. And so we can look at the people who actually do that.
We also do grooming in KubeADM. So like, if we're grooming someone to become an approver, it's pretty obvious, like, they're involved in the PRs and they're dovetailing with other approvers. So they're not acting autonomously. We're not trying to just do it independently. These people are actively engaged and working with the other approvers to make sure that they're doing what's in the best interest, and they recognize the minutia that can exist between some of the issues.
So for the existing PR, I can sync with you offline too. updated.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of maintainers there that are certainly not currently active on the project that we should remove. It's going to leave the list pretty short, though.
I'm just wondering whether we should couple the two together in the case of Vince's proposal to add himself to approvers and the potentially longer discussion around removing some of the existing people.
Sure. I guess I wanted to open it up so that we could see if other people thought that they should also be reviewers or approvers at this point, right?
Makes sense.
I'd rather, like Tim was saying, set one PR with a long timeout and make all the changes in bulk, rather than have like a long series of, oh, this person, now this person, this person, now we have the removal, and sort of just take it all in one shot. I know that sets the clock out a little ways for Vince, which is a little unfortunate, but I think it's probably the right way to do it. And Vince, when he goes through an LGDM's PRs, it makes it much quicker for me to approve them anyway. So that's still helpful in the meantime, right?
So I'm not sure if everybody's seen that email about using some sort of a tool to add to do team management in GitHub. Would this tie into that, or would this be something orthogonal?
I think that tool being referenced was to automatically manage the GitHub groups, right? Like if you go into the GitHub interface for like the Kubernetes SIGs organization, you can see like the list of groups in GitHub. And there was one that was recently created to be cluster API admins, in fact. So those are people that have GitHub level ACLs to the repo. And this, what we're talking about now, is like the owner's files, which is sort of a Kubernetes mechanism within a GitHub repo to allow people that don't have GitHub ACLs to still be able to use the bots to allow automation to make changes to the code.
Okay.
So it might be useful in the sense that if we could get the automation to also synchronize like the GitHub groups with what's in our owner's files, then it could be useful. But if it's just synchronizing GitHub groups with like a YAML file that's checked in somewhere, then it's sort of at a different level than what we're talking about here. It does overlap with the section of the owner's files. It's like the alias for like the SIG cluster lifecycle leads or the cluster API admins. Those are both should be backed by GitHub groups. But the maintainers, which is the bottom list, which is the people that have approval, that would be separate. At least today, that's separate from a GitHub group.
Okay.
So like recently, like Tim Sinclair was added to the GitHub ACLs so he could tinker with all the UI widgets in GitHub, like adding labels and milestones and shuffling issues around. But that's separate from being listed as a maintainer or an admin in the owner's file. So lots and lots of different ACLs.
That leads into the next bullet point. Should we start it?
Yeah, I don't think, unless somebody else has something about this one. But.
We now VMware and previously as Heftio, we have been waiting patiently for an actual final cut of V1 Alpha 1. And not only that, but we would like to actually help drive forwards any things that we want to do to get that hard milestone into place. So I'm volunteering myself to stand up to help do sort of the scrubbing of the backlog to get the milestones in order, so that way we can start just like legitimately executing to try and get a cut of a release within a reasonable time frame, maybe a couple of months. The reason being is because we want to cut a release of Cluster API AWS provider, but we're kind of explicitly blocking that release on the formal cut of V1 Alpha 1 of Cluster API. We want to make sure that we're doing the best thing by the community. I don't want to do it in absentia, so I want to talk with you, Robbie, as well as on the SIG call to try and help groom the backlog and try to get it into working order so we can just go. And I'm not certain, too, I couldn't do it purely by myself right now because there are some issues that have just been there since Epoch that I don't even know if they even apply anymore. So.
Yeah, I've tried to take a couple passes and get rid of most of those, but I'm sure there are still some floating around. So one thing that we talked about around KubeCon was once we had gotten to the point where CRDs supported conversion, then like we might as well cut a release because we can kind of move people forward, right? And that's I think what we did with kubeadm is we could cut v1 alpha 1 and v1 alpha 2 because we had the ability to still make changes but not break people as we migrated them. I don't remember exactly when that's coming to CRDs, but it may not be coming soon enough, right, to meet your we'd like this in the next couple of months deadline. So I think that implies we really want to take a scrub over the API surface and make sure that we're really happy with it if we aren't going to be able to easily move fields around for a little while.
So the initial conversion webhooks landed as a feature that you can enable in 1.13. So it's not GA yet. I think it's beta, but we can enable it in 1.13. The holdup for us right now is the webhook tooling in KubeBuilder isn't there yet for the conversion webhooks, and that's kind of what's driving the work that I've been doing to start updating the dependencies there to 1.13.
Okay, so maybe that's a little bit closer than I was thinking. That would be great. Because I think if we were at the point where we had some tooling in place where we could say, we can move you forward, then it's going to be a lot easier for us to say, here's a first alpha. We can at least agree that it's a good enough starting point and we can get you off of it. What I want to avoid is getting people stuck with a dead end where we say, to get from point A to point B or alpha 1 to alpha 2, you have to completely blow things away and start over, right? We may end up there anyway, but it would be nice if there was an automated path forward.
The one thing too is like, does it need to be an alpha 1 for the conversion, or does it need to be an alpha 2? Right? Like if we cut the alpha 2, we just need the conversion upgrade because you're never going to go back. Like traditionally in Kubernetes land, you never go back. And in fact, I don't even know of precedent to actually verify that object conversion backwards actually works. So we would just, as long as we had the alpha 2, which could be several months from now, have the conversion, we would be fine. But I do think there's like a limited list of how we want to do this. Also, just in general, like cluster API itself is slightly different from the grooming for most other things in SIG cluster lifecycle now. We've kind of spread the kubeadm goodness across multiple repos, and it just makes it easier for new folks who want to get involved to follow the same standard pattern, which I was supposed to write up for some of the other folks who wanted to follow that pattern as well. So maybe I'll do that first before do that alongside this other thing.
It would be great. Also, once you write that up, we should talk about that during the SIG meeting and see if we can get, Kops and Minikube and everybody else following sort of a similar pattern. If we're going to apply it across the repos, it would be great if the other sub projects that sort of nominally fall under the SIG can slowly start to adopt those as well.
Yeah, Minikube asked me specifically about this problem, and AWS provider and kubeadm both follow the same pattern.
Excellent. Well, I think that was the end of today's agenda. I missed last week. I'm sorry, I was not feeling super great. I did make a new meetings note doc for the year. Hopefully people realize that and they're looking at the right doc. And there's a link at the bottom to last year's notes. They're still there. They're sort of in an archived state. And I think that was the only other big thing I want to mention. I've been trying to go through the PR backlog, especially the ones that have been LGTM'd, and get things merged now that I'm sort of back and checking email again. And hopefully we can start to pick up some speed now that we've hit the new year. I guess one other reminder for folks, the CFP deadline for the KubeCon EU is coming up in a couple of weeks. I know that I think David and Daniel were planning on submitting at least one talk about the cluster API. But if other folks are also looking at submitting talks, don't forget that that deadline is, I think it's on like the 18th or something. It's really soon now. So I think that was about it. Anybody else have any last agenda topics? Going once, going twice. All right. Well, hopefully my recording of this meeting will be somewhere that I can actually upload it to YouTube, and we'll get it linked. Otherwise, we will see folks. I think next week we have a SIG meeting on Tuesday, and then another one of these meetings next Wednesday. We will see you then. Thanks. Take care.